Hello there, and welcome to the Quantum Slumber, where big ideas unfold slowly, and curiosity gets to feel calm again. Tonight's question is a little unusual. It isn't about rockets or black holes, it's about you, and the strange fact that, from the inside, consciousness has a stubborn way of continuing to be here. After all, you've never personally witnessed your own absence. You've watched endings happen to stories, to days, to chapters. But your awareness has always arrived at the next moment holding a single quiet headline. I'm still here. And that simple, eerie truth leads to a thought some physicists and philosophers have played with for decades. If reality at its deepest level doesn't choose a single outcome, if it allows many outcomes to exist side by side, then what does that mean for an observer, for a mind, for the feeling of being the one who continues? We're going to explore a concept that can feel comforting at first, and then, very gently, a little unsettling. Not because it's a ghost story, not because it's meant to scare you, but because it presses on the edges of what we think it means to end, and what it means to experience anything at all. So as we begin, just let the pace be slow. You don't need to solve anything tonight. You don't need to agree with the idea either. Think of this as a quiet walk through a strange museum, a place where the exhibits are questions and the lights are kept low on purpose. And if you enjoy this kind of calm, sleep-friendly science, you can gently support the channel by tapping like or subscribing so more people can find their way here. I'd also love to hear from you in the comments. Where are you listening from tonight, and what time is it there? Now, with that said, here's the thought that makes people pause. What if the universe contains countless versions of the story, and from the inside, you can only ever notice the chapters where consciousness continues? There's a simple sentence that sounds harmless, until you sit with it long enough for it to get strange. You can't experience your own non-existence. Not in the direct first-person way you experience a warm cup of tea, or the weight of a blanket, or the soft drift of a thought. From the inside, awareness doesn't have a camera that can film nothing. It can only film something. Even when you imagine darkness, you're still there to imagine it. Even when you picture an empty room, there's still a quiet you standing at the doorway, noticing the emptiness. And that makes life feel a little asymmetrical. You have memories, you have dreams, you have moments that blur and fade, but every moment you've ever known has arrived with the same private signature: presence, a breath, a thought, a tiny witness inside you saying, almost without words, this is happening. So here's the unsettling twist. If consciousness can only ever report from the moments where it exists, then from the perspective of consciousness itself, the idea of a personal ending becomes hard to hold. Not emotionally, endings are real. We grieve, we fear, we love like time matters because it does. But conceptually, when you try to picture your last frame, you find that you're still watching the screen. That doesn't mean a person can't end. It doesn't mean the universe owes anyone a continuation. It only means something narrower and more haunting. The viewpoint you call I has no way to sample the state where it isn't there to sample anything at all. It's like asking a light to describe darkness from inside the bulb. And once you notice this, you start to see why certain ideas, usually spoken about cautiously, almost apologetically, keep resurfacing in physics circles, not as a promise, not as a comfort. More like a glitch in the way being an observer is built into the story we tell ourselves about reality. Because physics at its best is very good at describing the outside of things. The mass of a star, the arc of a comet, the probability of a particle showing up here instead of there. But consciousness is not an outside measurement to you. It's the inside condition that makes measurement feel like anything at all. So when someone says, maybe there are branches of reality, or maybe outcomes don't collapse into one, the thought naturally follows like a shadow. If multiple outcomes exist, then somewhere there will always be an outcome where the observer continues. And from the observer's seat, that's the only seat you ever find yourself sitting in. It's an idea that feels like hope for about 5 seconds, and then becomes something else, because it doesn't sound like a miracle. It sounds like a rule, a cold rule, a rule that doesn't care about comfort or meaning or the kind of life you'd actually want, only about the bare fact of continued witnessing. And that's the mood we're exploring tonight. Not a ghost story, but a logical shiver. The feeling that reality might allow a peculiar kind of continuity, not because it's kind, but because the act of observing can only ever report back from the places where observation still happens. Which raises the quiet question at the center of all this. Why does observation seem to matter in the first place? If that last idea left a little chill in your chest, you're not alone, because it doesn't really feel like a story yet. It feels like a strange fact about being a mind. And to connect that feeling to physics, we have to touch one of the quietest, most stubborn puzzles in all of science. It's often called the measurement problem. That phrase sounds technical, like a lab issue, like someone forgot to calibrate a device. But it isn't that. It's more like a question about when a possibility becomes a reality. When could happen turns into did happen. In everyday life, things have definite properties whether you look or not. A coffee mug is on the table. A streetlight is either red or green. A coin in your pocket is either heads or tails, even if you haven't checked yet. Our instincts assume the world is already decided, and observation is just how we learn what's true. Quantum mechanics asks us to hold a more slippery picture. At the smallest scales, the math that predicts experiments doesn't describe a particle as having one clear, single state before you measure it. It describes a spread of possibilities, a kind of both and that isn't just ignorance. It's built into the rulebook. People call this superposition, but you don't need the word to feel the idea. Imagine a coin spinning on a table. While it spins, it's not heads or tails in the normal sense. It's a motion that contains the possibility of both, and you don't get a final answer until it lands. That's a friendly metaphor, because with the coin, the landing is just ordinary physics. We understand what made it settle. Quantum superposition is stranger because it can exist even without a clear, classical landing mechanism. The math treats the system like a set of overlapping potential outcomes. Not one story, many stories, all at once. And here is where the discomfort begins. When you measure a quantum system, when you ask it a yes or no question in the language of instruments, you don't get a little of each outcome. You get one outcome, one click, one dot on the screen, one result written into the world. So the puzzle is simple to say and hard to digest. If the system is described as multiple possibilities, why do we ever experience a single reality? There are a few ways people talk about this, but the most honest version starts with a calm admission. Quantum mechanics gives us breathtakingly accurate predictions, and yet it's strangely quiet about what's really happening between measurements. It tells you the probabilities with exquisite precision. It tells you what you should expect to see. But the moment you ask why reality feels definite, the theory starts to feel incomplete. Not wrong, just incomplete in the way a map can be perfect for navigation and still not tell you why the city exists. One reason this question got entangled with the word observation is historical. Early explanations sometimes sounded like consciousness was doing something magical, like the universe waits for a mind to look and then chooses. That idea is tempting because it matches the emotional shape of the problem. The world feels undecided, then suddenly decided, right where awareness touches it. But modern physics doesn't need that kind of mysticism to stay weird. In practice, observation usually means interaction, a detector, a screen, a scattered photon, an environment full of tiny nudges that record information. The moment a quantum system becomes linked to something big and messy, something that can store a trace, the superposition stops behaving like a neat, private cloud of possibilities and starts behaving like a single outcome. This is where you'll hear the word decoherence. Think of it as the universe's way of smearing delicate quantum possibilities into the rough texture of everyday reality. Not because a human mind showed up, but because the system got entangled with the environment, air molecules, light, vibrations, until the different possibilities could no longer interfere with each other in any detectable way. Decoherence explains something crucial: why quantum weirdness doesn't usually survive in the large objects, why cats don't appear half here and half there, why a coffee mug doesn't blur into a spectrum of locations. The world is noisy, and noise is a kind of measurement happening all the time. And yet, if you listen closely, decoherence doesn't fully close the case. It tells you why possibilities stop overlapping in a way we can observe. It tells you why the universe acts classical to us. But it doesn't quite answer the deeper question. Out of the menu of possibilities, why do you experience one dish? Some people treat that as a non-question. Stop asking, they'll say, gently or not. The theory works. The results are the results. Others think the question is real, and the answer depends on what you believe the wave function actually represents. Is it just a tool for calculating probabilities, like a weather forecast for particles? Or is it a description of reality itself, something physically meaningful in the world? Because if it's only a tool, then collapse might just be an update in our knowledge. We learn an outcome, and we rewrite our description. The universe didn't do anything dramatic. We just stopped being uncertain. But if the wave function is real, if it's the real fabric of the system, then collapse becomes a physical event. Something actually happens that turns many possibilities into one outcome. And now you're forced to ask, what triggers that event? Where is the line? Is it the size of the system? The complexity? The presence of a record? A threshold of irreversibility? A boundary between quantum and classical? That boundary is famously hard to locate. And this is the point where the measurement problem stops being an abstract puzzle and starts sounding like a philosophical pressure point. Because it touches the oldest human intuition, that the world is out there, finished and definite, whether or not anyone is watching. Quantum mechanics asks you to consider that definiteness might be something that emerges, that the crispness of reality might be a kind of late-stage effect, a stable story formed out of deeper uncertainty. If you're wondering why any of this matters for our theme tonight, here's the soft connection. The idea of quantum immortality doesn't come from a ghost story. It comes from taking one particular response to the measurement problem very seriously. A response that says, maybe nothing ever collapses. Maybe the possibilities don't get reduced to one. Maybe the universe doesn't choose. Maybe it keeps everything. And if that sounds like the kind of thought that would only be suggested once, quietly, by someone willing to be misunderstood, you're beginning to feel the atmosphere of the next turn in this conversation. Because in the late 1950s, one young physicist looked at this whole problem and offered a solution so radical it still makes people sit back in their chairs, even when they disagree with it. In the middle of the 20th century, quantum mechanics was already doing something almost miraculous. It was predicting experiments with a kind of calm perfection, lines on a page turning into dots on a screen, again and again, as if nature had agreed to follow the same strange grammar every time we asked a careful question. And yet, underneath that success, there was a soft embarrassment nobody could quite ignore. Because the math that worked so well seemed to come with an extra rule, an awkward rule that didn't look like the rest of physics. Most of the time, quantum systems evolve smoothly. The equations run forward like a steady current. But then, when a measurement happens, the story appears to jump. Possibilities narrow into one outcome. The wave function, this mathematical object that holds all the potential results, seems to do something dramatic. It seems to collapse. That collapse was useful. It gave physicists a recipe. Calculate the spread of possibilities, then apply the collapse rule to match what you observe. But it left a question hanging in the air like a quiet fog. What is collapse really? Is it a physical event? Is it a change in the world? Or is it just a change in our description? A bookkeeping trick that tells us how to update what we know. And then, in 1957, a young physicist named Hugh Everett offered a response that was almost unnervingly simple. He didn't try to patch collapse. He removed it. Everett's proposal begins with an attitude that feels almost stubbornly clean. Keep the one rule that works everywhere else in physics. Keep the smooth evolution. Keep the idea that the wave function follows the same orderly equation at all times. No special exceptions. No sudden jumps. No moment where the universe breaks its own rhythm because a human looked at it. In Everett's view, the wave function doesn't collapse, ever. Not in a lab, not in deep space, not in the quiet dark between atoms. The wave function just keeps evolving, steadily, according to the ordinary quantum laws. So, if collapse isn't real, why do we see a single outcome? Everett's answer is where the floor starts to tilt. He said, you don't see a single outcome because the universe picks one. You see a single outcome because you become part of the quantum system you're observing. When you measure something, you aren't standing outside reality like a referee. You are a physical object. Your detector is a physical object. Your brain is a physical object. And when a quantum system interacts with a measuring device, the combined system, particle plus detector, does what quantum systems always do. It becomes entangled. Their states become linked. Instead of the particle has many possibilities and the detector has one clear state, you get a combined state that contains correlations. If the particle is this, the detector reads that. If the particle is that, the detector reads this. And if you include the observer, include the mind reading the detector, then the chain of correlations continues. In a simplified picture, the universe doesn't work like this. Many possibilities, and then one final result. It works more like this. Many possibilities unfolding into many correlated observer experiences. Each possible outcome comes paired with a version of the observer who witnessed it. Not because consciousness has magical power, but because consciousness is made of matter, and matter follows the same quantum rules. Everett originally framed this as a relative state idea. A system doesn't have one absolute state that the whole universe agrees on. It has a state relative to another system, relative to the detector, relative to the observer, relative to the particular branch of correlations you're inside. If you're listening and thinking, that sounds like splitting, you're feeling the core intuition. But it's important to notice the tone of Everett's move. He wasn't trying to write science fiction. He was trying to do the opposite, to remove the one rule in quantum mechanics that felt like a story humans told themselves to make sense of results. In that sense, Many Worlds is oddly conservative. It keeps the math. It keeps the smooth law. It refuses to add a special collapse mechanism that appears only when measurement happens. And that's why so many physicists, even those who don't personally believe it, admit it has a certain elegance. It doesn't put consciousness on a throne. It doesn't ask you to believe the universe has a mysterious "now choose one" button. It says, the wave function is the whole description, and it never stops being the description. Then, what we call a measurement is simply what it feels like from the inside when entanglement creates separate, non-communicating histories. This is where the word worlds can be both helpful and misleading, because Everett didn't necessarily mean a literal popping off of universes like bubbles. The more careful way to say it is, the universal wave function contains many consistent, decoherent branches, histories that no longer interfere with each other in any practical sense. They're like paths that have drifted apart so completely that they can't meet again. Not because of a supernatural barrier, but because the information required to make them overlap is smeared into the environment. In other words, the world doesn't split the way a cell divides with a clean line down the middle. It separates the way a whisper separates in a windstorm. Once the details are carried away into countless interactions, you can't gather them back. The branches become, for all practical purposes, different realities. And inside any one of those realities, things feel normal, they feel single, they feel decided. That's the subtle, unsettling beauty of it. Many Worlds doesn't say you experience everything. It says you experience one thread, because the version of you doing the experiencing is part of that thread. If you want a gentle metaphor, imagine a library with a book that keeps rewriting itself. Each time a quantum event happens, the book doesn't choose one ending and burn the others. It quietly prints more pages, pages that can't be read from the same chair, because each chair belongs to a different reader now, sitting with a different copy, in a slightly different room. From the perspective of any one reader, there is only one story. The ink is dry, the sentences are clear. The ending feels inevitable, because the reader can only hold one book at a time. Now, if you're wondering why this interpretation can feel so emotionally charged, it's because it smuggles in a strange kind of infinity without raising its voice. It suggests that reality may be far more generous than our intuition allows. Not generous in a comforting way, generous in a cold, mathematical way. An abundance of outcomes, an abundance of versions, an abundance of yes and no and almost unfolding in parallel. And to be fair, many worlds has its critics for good reasons. Some people dislike the ontological cost, the idea that you're multiplying realities to save the equations. Others argue that worlds are not precisely defined, or that probability becomes philosophically tricky if everything happens. Even among many world supporters, there's careful debate about what counts as a branch, how to define the measure of outcomes, and whether this is physics or metaphysics wearing physics clothing. But even critics tend to agree on one thing. Everett's move is coherent enough that you can't just laugh it away. It is a serious, structured attempt to answer the measurement problem by refusing to add extra rules. And it lands with a particular kind of eerie quietness, because it shifts the mystery from why did the universe pick this outcome to something more intimate. If every outcome exists, what exactly am I? Not am I special, but am I singular? Because in Everett's picture, the most ordinary moments in your life, the ones you'd never think to call quantum, are built on top of countless microscopic branchings, tiny forks that never announce themselves, tiny differences that never make the news, tiny divergences that, over time, can grow into completely different biographies. It's not that your life becomes less real. It's that your life stops being one line in the cosmic ledger. It becomes a family tree. And it does all of this while keeping a strangely important promise, one that echoes tonight's theme in the background, even before we say it out loud. In many worlds, there is no final collapse, no ultimate snuffing out of possibilities. The wave function never shuts the door. It keeps the whole space of outcomes alive, indefinitely. Which means the next question isn't whether there are other versions. It's how quickly they drift apart, and how far a single choice or a single random quantum event can carry you from the familiar life you recognize into a life that feels just slightly off. Not dramatic at first, just different in tiny, accumulating ways. Countless versions quietly diverging. In Everett's picture, the universe doesn't make a single clean choice and then erase the alternatives. The full quantum description keeps going, smoothly, relentlessly, like a sentence that never gets cut off mid-word. That's a hard thing to feel in your bones, because everyday life does feel like a sequence of final decisions. You chose this job, you moved to that city. You said yes, or you said no. A single line, a single you walking forward. But many worlds asks you to hold a stranger idea, gently, without rushing. What you experience as one outcome might simply be the outcome you're inside of. Meanwhile, the broader reality, the mathematical story, doesn't delete the other possibilities. It carries them along quietly, the way an ocean carries many currents at once. Start small, not with dramatic crossroads, with the soft, ordinary moments that barely register as choices. A turn signal, a coffee order, a pause before sending a message, a glance that becomes a conversation, or doesn't. Most of those moments don't feel quantum. They feel psychological, social, human, and they are. But in the background, beneath the calm surface, the physical world is built from events that are not fully pinned down until they become part of a definite record, until the world around them, in effect, learns what happened. And once a definite record exists, once information is spread outward into the environment, there's no easy way to stitch the alternatives back together. The possibilities that were once overlapping become effectively separate stories. That separation is the quiet engine behind the word branching. It's not that a glittery cosmic scissors snips reality into pieces. It's more like a fog lifting into distinct valleys. At first, possibilities can blur together. But as information leaks into the world, into air molecules, photons, memories, hard drives, the blur stops behaving like one thing. It starts behaving like many. So, branching is less like a magical split and more like a gradual, irreversible sorting. And once you imagine that sorting happening constantly, everywhere, it becomes hard to keep you as a single line. Because you aren't floating above physics. You're made of it. If outcomes diverge, then the version of you inside each outcome diverges too. Not because of a mystical duplication, but because the physical state that includes your body, your brain, your surroundings, is now different in each branch, subtly at first, then more clearly. At the beginning, these versions are almost indistinguishable. Two yous who both brush their teeth. Two yous who both remembered to lock the door. Two yous who both felt that tiny, familiar worry. Did I leave the stove on? But then the differences accumulate the way they always do in life, not as a single dramatic event, but as a slow drift. In one branch, you caught the light and made it through the intersection. In another, you hit the red and sat there for 40 seconds, listening to a different fragment of a song. In one branch, you looked up at the right moment and noticed an old friend's name on a storefront. In another, you kept your eyes forward and never saw it. None of that seems cosmic, and yet, if the world is genuinely branching, then the universe contains not just the you who was, but a growing spread of you who might have been, each one real within the branch that holds them. This is where the idea starts to feel uncanny, even if you keep it gentle. Because the word infinite isn't meant as poetry here, it's meant as a consequence. Given enough time, enough interactions, enough moments where the world could have gone two ways, the number of distinct histories becomes enormous. And the number of distinct you stories riding inside those histories becomes enormous too. Not cartoon duplicates, not identical clones lining up in a hallway. Something subtler, and honestly, more unsettling, a vast family tree of selves. Some branches separate by a hair, some separate by a mile. And if you zoom out far enough, you begin to see that your life might not be one story. It might be a region, an entire neighborhood of nearby stories, all sharing a common past, all fanning outward into different futures. The mind naturally asks, but why don't I feel that? Why do I only ever experience one? Many worlds doesn't say you're missing something mystical. It says experience is local. Consciousness, whatever it ultimately is, rides along with a particular physical process. You feel the branch you're in the way you feel the room you're in. Not because the other rooms don't exist, but because you're not inside them. And that can be framed in a calm way that still keeps its eerie edge. Your awareness is like a lantern traveling through a forest at night. The forest may be wide, the paths may be many, but the lantern only lights one path at a time. A tiny recap just to keep the map steady. Many worlds suggests the wave function doesn't collapse into one outcome. Instead, interactions spread information and make alternatives effectively separate. When alternatives separate, the version of you inside each alternative separates too. That's the gentle backbone of infinite you. Now, there's a trap hidden in the word infinite, and it's worth stepping around it. Infinite selves doesn't mean all selves are equally likely in the way your intuition uses the word likely. Many worlds has a notion of weight, a measure of how much of the total wave function sits in different outcomes. People argue about what that really means and how to connect it to probability. But even without getting technical, you can hold the basic caution. Branching isn't a free pass to believe every imaginable story is waiting for you, like a menu. It's not a wish machine. It's a structure, a way of keeping the mathematics smooth without inserting a special moment where nature must choose one result and burn the rest. Still, the emotional effect remains. Because once you accept that, you can diverge into countless nearby versions. You start to wonder what happens at the edge cases. the places where the future isn't just different, but feels like it has an ending. And that's when physics brushes up against the most human question of all. Not what happens to the universe, but something quieter. What happens to experience when a story would normally stop? That question is where the tone changes, not into panic, not into melodrama, into a colder kind of curiosity, like touching the outside of a window on a winter night and realizing how thin the glass really is. At first, the idea of branching lives can feel almost playful, like a thought experiment you can hold at arm's length, a handful of alternate turns, alternate conversations, alternate mornings that began 5 minutes earlier or later. But then the mind does what it always does when you give it a wide enough horizon. It walks quietly toward the edge. Because once you accept that reality might not be a single track, you can't help noticing that the most important fork in any human story is not a career choice, or a city, or a relationship. It's the point where the story ends. Not in a dramatic, cinematic sense. Just in the ordinary way every living system has limits. A candle doesn't hate the dark. It simply runs out of wax. A wave doesn't decide to stop. It loses energy and dissolves into the sea. And so, without meaning to, the branching picture brushes against a question that is almost too intimate for physics. If there are countless versions of you, quietly diverging, what happens when some of those versions reach an ending? The first reaction most people have is emotional, not scientific. A tightening in the chest, a refusal, a soft, internal, don't go there. And that reaction makes sense. Mortality is not just an idea. It's stitched into how we plan, how we love, how we take a day seriously. Even when we don't talk about it, it's there, like the faint hum of a refrigerator in a quiet house. But in this particular corner of thought, mortality appears in an unusual costume, not as tragedy, not as fear, as a logic puzzle. Because the many worlds picture invites a strange kind of contrast. From the outside, the universe might look like a vast library of outcomes, some bright, some dim, some ending sooner, some later. From the inside, though, you are not outside. You're always inside a single live thread, with a single stream of moments arriving one at a time. And here's the gentle twist that makes people pause. You never experience the moments when you are not experiencing anything. That sentence is almost trivial, and yet it carries an eerie weight when you let it settle. You don't have a first-person view of being asleep without dreams. You don't have a first-person view of anesthesia. You don't observe the time before you were born. There is no internal camera rolling during the gaps. Experience, by definition, only includes experiences. So, the mind starts wondering, softly at first, then more insistently, whether an ending can ever be part of first-person experience at all. Not in the sense of avoiding it, or denying it, or turning it into a motivational slogan, just in the narrow philosophical sense. If a moment contains no awareness, then for you, that moment never appears. It isn't a scene you watch. It isn't a room you enter. It's simply not a chapter in the book of your inner life. Most people have felt a mild version of this in everyday life. You lie down, you wake up. 8 hours are gone, as if someone removed them with a clean cut. You don't remember the passing of non-awareness. You remember the last thought before sleep and the first thought after. Now enlarge that intuition, not as a claim, but as a question. If awareness is what it feels like to be you, can not being aware ever be something you personally encounter? And when you set that question beside many worlds, the shape of a new idea begins to form. In many worlds, when an outcome has more than one possibility, the universe doesn't pick one and throw away the rest. The total story contains them all, and inside that total story, there may be branches where awareness continues and branches where it does not. The disturbing suggestion, again, just a suggestion and not a settled fact, is that your perspective would be biased toward the branches where perspective still exists. Not because you're special, not because consciousness has magical powers, not because the universe loves you, only because you noticing anything at all requires a branch in which noticing is still happening. It's a kind of selection effect, but it arrives wearing a human face. From the outside, There might be many outcomes. From the inside, you only ever find yourself in an outcome that includes finding yourself. And this is where the tone shifts from cosmic to personal. Because it can sound at first like comfort, like a loophole, like a secret door out of the most ancient fear. But the deeper you look, the less it behaves like comfort. For one thing, it isn't saying you're safe. It isn't saying your life can't end in the ordinary sense that other people observe. It isn't saying pain or loss are illusions. It isn't giving you a promise you can take to the bank. It's doing something colder. It's suggesting that a certain kind of storytelling problem exists when you try to imagine your own non-experience from the inside. And when people get drawn into this topic, it's often because the idea lands in a very specific place. The gap between what we can measure out there and what it feels like to exist in here. A physicist can describe a brain as matter and energy, information processing, chemistry, and electricity. A philosopher can describe a person as a pattern, a continuity, a narrative thread. A doctor can describe the conditions under which consciousness fades. All of those descriptions can be true and still leave a haunting leftover question. Where is the point of view located in a universe that may not collapse into a single line? And if the universe contains many lines, why are you on this one? That question, asked slowly, is what turns this from a science explainer into an existential mirror. Not a scary mirror, just an honest one. So, if you felt the story getting more intimate right here, that's why. We've been talking about branching like a cosmic map. Now it's touching the most human boundary. And in the next stretch, a few thinkers try to formalize that boundary carefully, mathematically, and with a kind of uneasy humility by asking what happens when you combine many worlds with the simple fact that you can only ever observe a universe in which observation continues. There's a moment in this story where the mood changes again, not because the physics gets louder, but because the reasoning gets sharper. Up to now, we've been circling an unsettling idea. If the wave function never collapses, then outcomes don't get selected in the usual way. They all remain in a kind of quiet coexistence. And somewhere inside that vast coexistence, there are branches where awareness continues, and branches where it doesn't. Now the mind wants to do something very human. It wants to stand in the middle of that cosmic branching and ask, almost softly, almost as if it's trying not to spook itself, okay, but which one do I end up in? And this is where Max Tegmark's name tends to appear in conversations. Not as a final authority, not as a stamp of certainty, but as someone willing to follow an implication all the way to its uncomfortable edge. He's a physicist who's written and spoken about reality in unusually broad frames, multiverses, mathematical structure, the strange way being an observer sneaks into questions that seem, at first, purely objective. The key move here is simple to say, and very hard to feel neutral about. It's the idea of anthropic reasoning, the idea that any observation you make is automatically filtered by one fact. You can only observe from a situation in which an observer exists. That sounds obvious, almost silly, like saying you can only read a book if you have eyes. But in cosmology and physics, that silly filter can matter. It's used carefully in questions like, why do the constants of nature fall in a narrow range that allows stars to burn for billions of years? Why is the universe old enough for complexity? Why does the chemistry of life even have time to happen? Anthropic reasoning doesn't claim the universe was designed for observers. It's more like a reminder that observers are a biased sample. If there are many possible universes or many possible regions, you shouldn't be surprised to find yourself in one of the rare places where finding yourself is possible. In other words, selection effects can masquerade as meaning. And once you accept that, the many worlds picture offers a new, more personal selection effect. Not which universe can support observers at all, but which outcomes can support me noticing outcomes. If you're an observer moving through time, then every moment you remember has one hidden prerequisite. You were conscious in that moment. You can't remember a moment you weren't aware. You can't report a moment you didn't experience. The stream of first-person life is already a kind of curated archive. So Tegmark-style reasoning asks you to notice something almost mechanical about subjectivity. From the inside, you only ever encounter states in which you are able to encounter anything. That's not comforting yet. It's just a description of what it means to have a point of view. Now place that description into a branching universe. If reality contains multiple outcomes, including outcomes in which an observer continues and outcomes in which the observer doesn't, then there's a strange asymmetry between the outside view and the inside view. From the outside view, imagine a cosmic accountant watching all branches. Some fraction of branches contain an ongoing observer, and some do not. From the inside view, your view, there is no such thing as being in a branch where you don't exist, because there is no one there to experience it. That branch is not a destination your consciousness arrives at. It's simply a line in the ledger that contains no viewpoint. So the thought takes shape. If the universe keeps branching, then maybe you should expect to always find yourself in branches where you keep finding yourself. It sounds like hope. It lands like hope. It's almost impossible not to feel a flicker of it. But it's a particular kind of hope, the kind that appears when you confuse what you can observe with what is true overall. Anthropic reasoning is notorious for this. It can be used responsibly, like a warning label, your sample is biased. Or it can be used recklessly, like a superstition. The universe must be arranged around me. Tegmark's framing, at least the way people often encounter it online, sits right on that knife edge. Because the selection effect is real in a narrow sense. You can't observe your own absence. But turning that into, therefore you never end, is a leap. A seductive leap. A leap that feels like it has logic behind it, even when the logic is only describing the limitations of viewpoint. And still, the trap is set. Because once you've heard the selection effect, your mind wants to test it. It wants to build a minimal scenario where the logic can be examined without distractions. A clean, abstract setup where continuing and not continuing are the only differences. A situation so stripped down that the eerie conclusion, if it shows up, has nowhere to hide. That's why this next step is usually a thought experiment. Not because we want drama, but because thought experiments are where philosophical fog sometimes clears. And one more thing matters before we step into it. Even if you take many worlds seriously, and even if you take anthropic selection seriously, nothing here is granting comfort. Nothing here is promising a gentle continuation. The reasoning doesn't say, you will be okay. It only whispers something colder and more precise. If there exists any branch in which you continue to have experiences, then from the inside, your story might feel like it keeps going. That's the bait. And now, with the trap set, not by fear but by logic, we can look at the simplest possible branching setup and ask what your viewpoint would actually do inside it. Let's keep this as clean and gentle as possible. Not because the idea is fragile, because it's sharp. When people argue about quantum immortality, they usually reach for a thought experiment that's intentionally simple. It removes the messy parts of real life and leaves you with only one variable that matters. Does experience continue, or does it stop? So imagine a setup with two possible outcomes each time it runs. In one outcome, your conscious experience continues normally. In the other, your conscious experience does not continue. There is no next moment from your point of view. No drama, no details. Just a binary switch that either preserves the next frame of awareness or doesn't. Now add the many worlds ingredient we've been circling. The idea that the wave function doesn't collapse, and so both outcomes exist in different branches of reality. From the outside, in the bird's eye view, the story is straightforward. The universe branches into two futures. One contains a version of you that keeps thinking. One does not. But the inside view, the view you can't escape, is where the unease begins. Because from the inside, you never get to be a witness in the branch where there is no witness. You can talk about it. You can point to it on a diagram. You can imagine it like a path on a map. But you cannot arrive there as an experiencing subject. And that tiny asymmetry, the difference between what exists and what can be experienced, becomes the lever that pries open the whole argument. Try to feel how it works without rushing. Suppose the device runs once. From the outside view, there are now two branches. In one, you continue. In one, you don't. From the inside view, there is only one branch in which you can notice anything at all, the continuing one. The other branch has no observer moment inside it, because there's no observer left to have a moment. So after one run, if you ask, what do I experience next? The only coherent answer seems to be, you experience the branch where experience continues. That still sounds almost trivial. It's like saying, if you're conscious, you're conscious. But now repeat the run, and repeat it again. Each time, the outside view says, the number of branches multiplies. A branching tree spreads outward, half the twigs containing ongoing experience, half the twigs containing no further experience. Yet the inside view keeps doing something eerie and consistent. It keeps selecting only the twigs where selection is possible. If you're sitting in first-person awareness, you never wake up in a branch where you don't wake up. So the argument starts to sound like this. As long as there is at least one branch in which your consciousness continues, then from your own perspective, you should expect to find yourself in a branch where it continues. Not because you're special, not because reality loves you, not because the universe is protecting you, but because the branches where you don't continue contain no point of view to register anything. This is the most hypnotic part of the idea. It's not emotional, it's not spiritual, it's almost bureaucratic. It's the logic of a filter that says, experiences can only be sampled from the set of states where experience exists. Now, let's make the thought experiment slightly more precise, the way careful people do. Instead of saying half the time casually, imagine the device has some probability, p, of producing the continuing outcome, and 1 minus p of producing the non-continuing outcome. If p is large, continuing is common in the branching tree. If p is tiny, continuing is rare. Many worlds says both outcomes happen, weighted in some sense by their probabilities. Branches aren't all equally important. Some have more measure, more weight, more amplitude squared behind them, depending on how you formalize it. And the moment you introduce weights, you can ask a much more uncomfortable question. Even if there is always some branch where you continue, what kind of branch is it? Is it typical? Or is it the kind of branch that becomes, over time, vanishingly thin, almost like a thread you're balancing on in the dark? Because this is where the thought experiment stops sounding like a clever loophole and starts sounding like a trap. Imagine running the device not once, but many times. From the outside view, a huge branching structure forms. If continuing is common, there are many continuing branches early on. If continuing is rare, there are fewer. But no matter what, in a branching universe, there will be at least one path, at least one sequence of outcomes, where continuing happens every single time. A path like continue, 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 a perfect streak. The probability of that streak in a single world picture would shrink exponentially with every run. It would become absurdly unlikely. But many worlds doesn't ask whether it's likely, it asks whether it exists. And then the inside view steps in again, quietly, and says, if you can only have experiences along paths where you continue, then your lived story may be biased toward paths with unusually long streaks of continuing. It's a selection effect wearing a mask. From the outside, an extremely long streak is a statistical oddity. From the inside, that oddity could become your entire autobiography. And here's the subtle psychological punch. Your mind wants to translate that into, I am safe. But that translation is not justified by the thought experiment, because continuing to have some experience is not the same as continuing in a normal life. The thought experiment, in its stripped-down form, only preserves the fact of awareness. It does not promise the quality of that awareness. It does not promise clarity, comfort, or anything like a stable human narrative. It only says, if any observer moment exists, that is the only place the first-person camera can be. And if you sit with that, you start to see why the idea spreads so easily online. It offers a kind of secret door. It whispers, maybe there is no final blackout. Maybe the lights can't go out from the inside. But the same whisper has a second half that people tend to skip. If the only requirement is some observer moment, then the universe doesn't have to preserve a rich, healthy, ordinary life. It only has to preserve enough for you to still be there noticing anything at all. So, the thought experiment does two things at once. It makes ending feel philosophically slippery because you can't stand inside your own absence and report it. And it makes continuing feel philosophically cheap because the bar for continuing is just, there exists a viewpoint, not there exists a life you would recognize as living. That's why, in the most careful versions of this discussion, people slow down and separate two claims. Selection claim, you only ever observe branches where you are able to observe. Immortality claim, therefore your experience never ends. The thought experiment supports the first claim almost by definition. The second claim is where the trouble begins, because it smuggles in a hidden assumption that the observer is a stable, meaningful thing across branches and across time, and that continuing always means continuing as you in any rich sense. And even if you grant that assumption for the sake of argument, the thought experiment still doesn't hand you comfort. It hands you a new kind of dread. Because if I always find myself in the continuing branch is true in any sense, then what you're really saying is not, I will be spared, but something colder. I may be trapped in the rarest paths, where continuation keeps happening, even when normality doesn't. That's the point where the logic turns. The moment where the idea stops sounding like a loophole and starts sounding like a nightmare rule. And once you see that turn, the next question becomes unavoidable. If survival is defined only as some thread of awareness, what does survival look like when it stops looking like safety? Here's where the idea stops feeling like a clever loophole and starts feeling like a cold technicality. Up to this point, the logic can sound almost comforting. If reality branches, and if there is any branch where awareness continues, then from the inside, you only ever wake up inside the continuing branch. The branches where awareness ends are real in the mathematics, but they contain no next moment to be experienced. And that's the seduction. It turns a terrifying concept, an ending, into something that feels strangely unreachable from the first-person view. But there's a hidden swap happening in the listener's mind. We quietly replace continuing with being okay. We replace an observer moment exists with a life continues in a recognizable way. And those are not the same claim. If you're being strict about what the thought experiment actually guarantees, it guarantees only one thing. Some thread of experience remains available somewhere in the branching structure. It does not guarantee that the thread stays thick. It does not guarantee that the thread stays warm. It does not guarantee that the thread even feels like a human life, with continuity, comfort, and meaning. It only guarantees, not nothing. That's why the first horror is not the ending. It's the bargain. Because if the universe doesn't choose outcomes the way we intuitively think it does, then the only requirement for you to keep having a point of view might be unbelievably minimal. So minimal that it stops matching what you and I normally mean by survival. Think about what makes a life feel like your life. It's not merely the presence of awareness. It's the stability of memory, the smoothness of thought, the ability to recognize your own day, your own name, your own world. It's connection. Other minds that meet yours and confirm that what you're experiencing is shared, coherent, real. Now imagine a branching universe where continuing becomes rarer over time along the specific path that you, from the inside, keep landing on. Not rarer in the sense that it vanishes, because in many worlds, there's always some branch somewhere. Rarer in the sense that the continuing path becomes more and more unusual compared to the ordinary flow of outcomes. And when a path becomes more unusual, it begins to look contrived. Like reality is bending around a single requirement. This observer moment must exist. That is not safety. That is contingency. It's like confusing the fact that a candle is still lit with the idea that the room is warm. A flame can survive while everything else becomes inhospitable. a flame can persist as a thin, stubborn point long after it stops being a comfort. This is why careful people who discuss quantum immortality often sound less like optimists and more like pessimists with good manners. Because the internal logic, taken seriously, points toward an outcome that is psychologically chilling. If the only reason you keep going is that you can only ever observe branches where observation is possible, then you may be selecting, without intending to, the most marginal forms of continuation. Not the best, not the safest, not the most humane, just the ones that technically still contain a viewpoint. And once you see that, the meaning of immortality changes. It stops sounding like endless life and starts sounding like endless edge case existence. There's another angle that makes it even stranger. Even in an ordinary, non-branching picture of the world, we already know that being alive is not a single on/off switch. Conscious experience comes in gradients. It can be sharp or foggy, continuous or fractured, deep or shallow. We drift into sleep, we wake, we daydream, we lose track of time, we return. So if a branching universe only needs to preserve some form of observer moment, then it may preserve it at the lowest possible setting, like a system dropping into safe mode. And safe mode isn't life as you know it. It's the bare minimum for something to still be running. This is where the horror becomes quiet and almost mathematical. Because the comforting version of the story says, in a branching universe, you always find yourself in the branch where you continue. But the honest version adds, yes, and over long stretches, those continuing branches may be precisely the ones that become least like a normal world. And the reason is simple. Normal worlds don't need miracles. Normal worlds don't need reality to keep threading the needle over and over. They don't need the improbable to stack neatly, repeatedly, without slipping. But if your first-person experience is biased toward where experience continues, then your personal timeline may drift toward the edges of the probability distribution, toward the tails, toward the places where the math still allows you to exist, but where you are no longer living inside the center of ordinary expectation. And in that drift, the story stops being about escaping an ending. It becomes a story about what it means to keep having a point of view when everything else that makes a point of view worth having starts to thin. There's a psychological trap here too, and it's worth naming gently. The thought experiment can make a listener feel invincible because it focuses attention on the one perspective that continues. But invincibility is not the claim. The claim is closer to this. There may exist branches, however small their weight, where awareness persists. That's not a promise to you. It's not even a promise to the version of you that matters most to you, the one who remembers, loves, laughs, recognizes faces, and makes plans. It's a statement about existence in a multiverse, not a guarantee of well-being within it. So, the first horror is the possibility that the universe can satisfy the condition an observer exists, while withdrawing almost everything else. Not as punishment, not as intention, just as a cold consequence of how selection works, when the only experiences you can sample are the ones where sampling continues. And if you let that settle, you can feel the tone of the whole episode shift. Because now the question isn't, do you get to avoid the dark? The question becomes, what counts as you and what counts as continuing? If the only requirement is the continuation of a viewpoint, then the universe might not preserve the rich, fully lit version of consciousness that we instinctively picture when we hear the word life. It might preserve something thinner, something quieter, something that still notices, but no longer lives in the way we mean it. And that's why the next step in the story is so haunting, even without any drama or spectacle. Because once you accept that continuing doesn't automatically mean safe, you're forced to ask what continuation can collapse into, what the minimum, bare-bones form of conscious experience might look like. If reality only needs to keep the tiniest ember of awareness alive to satisfy the logic, that's where the idea stops being a comfort and starts becoming a corridor, long, narrow, and strangely well lit in all the wrong ways. And this is where the idea begins to cost something. Because once you accept that survival is not the same as safety, you start to notice a second, quieter problem hiding underneath the first. Continuation can shrink. If what's being preserved is simply a point of view, an observer moment, then the universe doesn't have to preserve the full, rich version of you that you're picturing right now. It doesn't have to preserve the familiar continuity of days, the clean stitching of memory to memory, the sense that your life is a single story moving forward in time. All it has to preserve is something like this. There is still something it is like to be you, and that something can be thinner than we want to admit. Most of us, without realizing it, treat consciousness like a light switch, on or off. But lived experience is not a switch, it's a dimmer, a spectrum, a shifting field. You already know this, not as philosophy, but as biology. You've drifted into sleep and woken up without remembering the exact boundary. You've gotten lost in a daydream and returned. You've had moments where you felt fully present, and moments where you moved through a room on autopilot. So, if the thought experiment is right, even in the most abstract way, then it's not hard to imagine the universe saving the observer moment while letting everything else degrade. Not out of cruelty, not out of intention, just out of the logic of selection. Because as branches accumulate, the branch that preserves a comfortable, ordinary kind of continuation may become less and less aligned with whatever conditions would normally interrupt that continuation. The more times the universe has to land on a continuation branch, the more the continuation branch starts to resemble a narrow path through a massive forest, still possible, still real, but increasingly specific. And specificity has a feeling. It feels like fragility. It feels like living in a world that is technically allowed, but no longer typical. This is the degradation cascade. It doesn't have to be dramatic. It doesn't have to be cinematic. In fact, the most unsettling version is quiet. So quiet it almost sounds like a clinical description of a system that's losing redundancy. Like a machine that still runs, but with fewer and fewer parts working the way they used to. At first the change is subtle, a thinning of continuity. Imagine, very gently, that the you who continues is still present, but the continuity between moments starts to fray. Not in a way that makes a clean line you can point at, but in a way that makes time feel less like a river, and more like a sequence of puddles. You're here, then you're here, then you're here again. And between those heres, something that used to be smooth becomes indistinct. This isn't an exotic claim. It's a reminder that consciousness is already stitched together by memory and brain states. If those supports weaken, what you get is not instant nothingness. What you get is something like a life that keeps technically existing, but with less and less of the familiar bridge work connecting one moment to the next. And now picture how this interacts with branching. If the only branches you ever find yourself in are the ones where some observer moment persists, then you may be selecting for the minimum viable conditions for observer moments to exist. Not because you choose to, because the alternative has no vantage point to report back from. That selection can have a strange effect. It can reward survival that is barely survival, like a system that keeps a single indicator light on, even as the rest of the dashboard goes dark. This is where the phrase minimum viable consciousness becomes haunting, because minimum viable is not a compliment. It's an engineering phrase. It means the smallest version that still counts as running. In human terms, it suggests a continuation that contains awareness but not wholeness. Awareness but not comfort. Awareness but not the stable, spacious mind you assume when you hear the word you. If you take that seriously, the cascade becomes easier to imagine. The you who continues might begin to feel like a narrowing tunnel. Not a tunnel that closes all at once, but a tunnel that slowly loses width. Less room for attention, less room for joy, less room for complex thought, less room for the rich layered feeling of being a person with a world. And what's left is a thinner observer, still there, still noticing, but doing so through a smaller aperture. This is why the thought experiment can become more disturbing the longer you sit with it. Not because it paints a vivid picture of catastrophe, but because it suggests a bizarre kind of endurance that is not the endurance we would wish for anyone. We tend to think that if something continues, it continues in full. But the universe doesn't owe fullness to the word continues. It only owes existence. So the cascade might look like this. Continuity becomes more grainy. You become less certain what counts as a day, what counts as a stretch of time, what counts as a continuous self. Your narrative identity, your sense of being one person moving forward, begins to feel less like a story and more like a flicker. And even that word flicker can mislead because it makes it sound dramatic. It can be subtler than that. It can feel like the world is still there, but your access to it is reduced. Like the resolution of experience slowly drops, not all at once, but in steps you can't quite predict. The simplest way to say it is this: the universe can keep you alive by keeping you barely able to observe. And if that's true, then the nightmare is not pain or spectacle. It's the quiet loss of everything that makes being alive feel like living. Now, at this point, the mind often tries to rescue itself with a hopeful objection. But surely, if awareness is present, it's still me, right? And that question, right, is the sound of the next trap opening. Because identity is not just awareness, identity is structure. It's the continuity of memory, the stability of preferences, the ability to recognize yourself as yourself from one moment to the next. And all of that depends on the substrate doing something very specific, very orderly, very sustained. If the cascade narrows the substrate's ability to keep that order, then the observer moment that remains may still count as someone experiencing something. But it becomes less clear that it counts as you in the way you mean it. Not because the universe is playing games, because you is already a delicate pattern, and patterns can persist in low fidelity. A melody can persist when only a few notes survive. A face can persist when only a few features remain. A person can persist when only a thin thread of awareness remains, thin enough that it no longer carries the richness of the original. This is where the immortality label starts to feel almost dishonest. Because immortality implies persistence of the self, not merely persistence of observation. But the cascade threatens exactly that. It preserves observation while eroding self. And there's an eerie calmness to that idea. Almost like a universe that is indifferent to our definitions, preserving the letter of the rule while letting the spirit evaporate. A point of view continues, therefore the system says the condition is met. And yet, the experience inside that point of view could be so narrow that continuing becomes a technicality rather than a gift. In the background of all of this is another subtle shift. As continuation becomes less typical, the world around you can begin to feel less typical too. If you keep landing in branches where the observer moment is preserved against the odds, then the environment that makes those odds work out may start to feel arranged. Not by a hand, not by a plan, but by the cold filtering effect of selection. It's like looking at a long sequence of coin flips and noticing that your personal history has too many heads in a row, so many that it stops feeling like chance, even if chance is all it is. That can create a strange psychological atmosphere, not terror exactly, but unreality, a sense that the world is still present but less trustworthy, less shared, less anchored. And if you're listening late at night, half relaxed, half curious, you can feel why this idea has a certain power. It doesn't need to shout. It just needs to whisper one sentence and let your brain do the rest. If consciousness can't observe its own absence, then the only thing guaranteed is the smallest sliver that still counts as observing. That's the cascade, a narrowing, a thinning, a continuation that becomes more technically true and less humanly recognizable. And if you keep following that logic, you arrive at a fork that philosophers love to linger over. Because once consciousness becomes minimum viable, there are at least two unsettling ways the story might continue, each quiet in its own way, each strange in a different direction. Some philosophers, trying to be as honest as possible about the logic, say the cascade doesn't end with a single kind of continuation. If experience can persist in a thinner and thinner form, if what's being preserved is the bare fact that someone is still having a moment, then there are at least two ways that thinning could feel from the inside. Neither of them needs drama. Neither of them needs a villain. They're unsettling for a simpler reason. They sound like what happens when you treat consciousness as a technical condition instead of a human life. So, let's hold this gently, the way you might hold a strange shell you found on a beach. Curious, careful, and not too eager to declare what it means. In the first scenario, experience doesn't stretch like a continuous ribbon. It becomes intermittent. Not in a clean, clock-like pattern, more like a signal struggling to stay above the noise floor. You know that feeling when you're half asleep and you can't quite tell whether a thought happened now or a minute ago? The boundary between moments blurs. In waking life, we don't notice how much effort the brain spends keeping a stable timeline. It's doing constant maintenance, linking this sensation to that memory, labeling this as me, stitching the present to the past. Now imagine, in the most abstract sense, that the universe keeps selecting for still observing, but it doesn't always select for that stable stitching. You would get awareness, brief, bright pinpricks of it, separated by stretches that don't register as experience, not because something happened in between, but because there's no coherent observer moment to hold the in-between. From the outside, it might look like time passing. From the inside, it might feel like blinking. Here, then, without the sensation of waiting, here again. A candle flaring, then dimming, then flaring. And the eerie part is that each flare could feel, in that instant, perfectly real. You could have a moment of clear presence with a thought like, I'm here, and then, before that thought has time to become a story, the story drops away. It's hard to talk about this without making it sound like a medical condition or a psychological episode, and that's not the point. The point is the logic. If continuity is what erodes first, then the you who continues might not experience a long, unfolding life. You might experience a scattered constellation of moments that never quite connect. In that scenario, immortality doesn't feel like endless time. It feels like endless arrivals, a sequence of awakenings that don't necessarily lead anywhere. And in a strange way, that can be more haunting than a clean ending, because an ending is at least coherent. It gives the story shape. This scenario removes shape while keeping existence. It preserves the bare minimum, an observer moment, without preserving a life worth calling a life. There's another twist too. If moments are sparse, then each moment can feel like it's floating in a void of context. The mind might search for memory and find only fragments. It might search for meaning and find only the immediate fact of being awake. It might try to plan, to hope, to orient itself, and then the moment is gone before the planning can become a path. It becomes a kind of cosmic strobe light, enough illumination to confirm that something is still seeing, not enough illumination to build a world. That's scenario A, the flickering life. The second scenario is different. It's not about gaps. It's about strain. In this version, experience remains more continuous, but it becomes increasingly forced, as though reality has to bend itself into more and more unlikely shapes to keep the observer moment intact. Again, the word force can mislead. Not forced by intention, forced by constraints, like a system optimizing for a single metric at the expense of everything else. Imagine you're watching a machine that must keep one tiny sensor online no matter what. If power is limited, it will shut down lighting, comfort, redundancy, anything non-essential to keep that sensor running. The sensor stays on. The building grows dark. In the thought experiment's language, the metric is simple. An observer exists. If that metric must be satisfied over and over across countless branchings, then the surviving branch might begin to look less like a natural continuation and more like a narrow channel that only remains open because of increasingly improbable alignments. Small improbabilities at first don't feel like anything. Human lives are full of near misses and coincidences. We shrug them off. We call them luck. But this scenario isn't about a single lucky day. It's about an accumulation that changes the texture of the world. The longer continuation persists, the more it may require a chain of unlikely just-so conditions, subtle deviations that keep the observer moment present when most branches would have ended it. Over time, you might start to feel as though reality is always doing delicate work behind the scenes, keeping the stage from collapsing under your feet. And that's where the dread comes in. Because if reality is constantly working harder to preserve observation, the costs show up somewhere. The world begins to feel tuned to your survival in a way that no longer resembles a shared, ordinary universe. It's like living in a story that has become too carefully written. The coincidences stack. The timing is always oddly perfect. The edges of randomness begin to look sanded down. And even if you cannot point to a single event and say, that was impossible, you can sense the pattern. You can sense that the world is no longer casual. It is attentive, not as a mind, as a filter, as a selection effect that, from your perspective, produces the same eerie result. You keep continuing into branches where continuation is still compatible with the world around you. In this scenario, the problem isn't that you blink in and out. The problem is that you keep moving forward into a reality that grows increasingly marginal, less statistically typical, less socially anchored, less normal in the way we mean when we say a life feels real. And because the story is about consciousness, not comfort, the continuity might persist even as everything that makes continuity humane begins to slip away. Stability, community, ordinary expectations, the sense that tomorrow will resemble today. And you don't need to imagine disasters for this to be disturbing. The disturbance is structural. The world becomes a corridor whose walls slowly lean inward. It's still a corridor, but it's not a home. Now, if you're listening and thinking, okay, but why would either of these happen? Why wouldn't I just continue in a perfectly normal way forever? That question is exactly what gives this section its bite. Because normal forever is an extraordinarily specific requirement. It asks not just for observation, but for sustained, rich, coherent personhood inside a stable world, over and over again, across an endless branching tree. That kind of continuation may exist in some branches. The thought experiment's chill is that you might not be typical within your own set of continuations. Not because you're unlucky, because you can only report from the branches where reporting is possible. So, the set of your experiences becomes biased toward continuations that preserve experience at any cost, whether that means thinning the experience into intermittent sparks or bending the world into increasingly narrow paths. Scenario A is the life of scattered moments. Scenario B is the life of sustained but increasingly improbable reality. One feels like drifting in and out of existence without ever getting the full story. The other feels like getting the story, but noticing the paper is getting thinner, and there's a final quiet commonality between them. Both scenarios isolate you. In the first, isolation comes from the lack of continuity. There's no long arc that allows relationships, projects, shared time to fully take root. In the second, isolation comes from divergence. Your branch becomes so atypical that it starts to separate you from the world most people inhabit, even if you're still physically surrounded by it. Either way, the immortality isn't a victory parade. It's a lonely persistence, a kind of existence that can continue while slowly losing the very things that make existence feel like a life, until what remains is just the bare, stubborn fact of awareness. And once you feel that, you can sense why some people call this idea a trap. Because even if it's only a thought experiment, only a philosophical echo inside a speculative interpretation of quantum mechanics, it points toward a particularly chilling possibility that continuing might not keep you in the world you love. It might keep you in the smallest possible corner of reality, where awareness can still somehow say, I am still here. And if that corner is where you end up, then the loneliest implication isn't the strangeness of physics. It's what happens to you in relation to everyone else as your branch drifts farther and farther from the ordinary world you started in. There's a particular moment in this idea, quiet, almost polite, where the fear stops being cosmic and becomes personal. Because once you accept the basic many worlds picture, you're no longer just thinking about reality in the abstract. You're thinking about relationships, You're thinking about the people who know your laugh, your habits, the little way you pause before you answer a hard question. And then the thought arrives, gently, like a cold fingertip on the edge of a warm mug. If consciousness continues only in branches where it can continue, then what happens to everyone else? In the world you're used to, we share endings together. People grieve together. They gather, they tell stories, they hold on to photos. They learn how to say a name without falling apart. It's communal, it's painful, but it's a kind of proof that love was real. But in the strange logic we're exploring tonight, the continuing observer doesn't get to share that ending. In countless nearby branches that differ only by a microscopic detail, a tiny roll of nature's dice, other versions of you don't continue, not in a dramatic, cinematic way. Simply, the stream of experience ends, the room goes on without you. The day keeps its schedule, the world keeps being the world. And in those branches, the people who love you do what people have always done. They try to make sense of an absence. They say, "I can't believe it." They replay the last conversation. They wish they'd said one more ordinary thing. They carry the weight that the continuing observer never feels firsthand. Now imagine what that means from your side. If you are the one who keeps finding yourself in the continuing line, if, subjectively, you keep waking up in whatever reality still has a place for your awareness, then the universe begins to feel like a room with one door that only swings inward. You don't see the branches where your story stops. You don't hear the first sob. You don't attend the gathering. You don't receive the phone call that changes the shape of a family. You simply keep going. And that's where the loneliness creeps in. Because the very thing that might sound hopeful at first, I can't experience my own non-existence, comes with a hidden cost. It cuts your experience away from the shared timeline of everyone else. Your loved ones are still out there, but not with you in the same way. In their most typical futures, the ones that physics would say are the thickest, the most statistically ordinary, your continuing thread may not exist at all. So you can picture it like this. The world most people inhabit is a wide highway. It's busy, it's common, it's where everyday life happens. Breakfasts, arguments, jokes, holidays, long, quiet afternoons. But the continuing observer path, if it's real, doesn't necessarily stay on that highway. It keeps taking narrower exits, not because it wants to, not because it chooses to, simply because continuing becomes a rarer condition. And each exit carries you farther from the crowd. At first, the difference is small enough that you'd never notice. Life feels normal. You'd still recognize your own kitchen. Your phone would still buzz. The sky would still look like the sky. But over time, the premise implies something unsettling. The set of realities where you continue might become less and less like the one where everyone else expects you to be. And that creates the loneliest implication of all. Even if you continue, you may continue alone. Not alone in the simple sense of being physically by yourself. Alone in the deeper sense, out of sync with the lives that were woven around yours. It's like becoming a kind of echo that can still hear the music, but can no longer find the orchestra. From the outside, your absence is a fact. It is recorded. It is mourned. It reshapes decisions and birthdays and empty seats at tables. From the inside, your experience remains stubbornly present. Your awareness can't step outside itself to confirm the absence that others are living with. So the theory creates a quiet split, not only of worlds, but of meaning. For them, the ending was real. For you, the ending never arrives. And if you hold that in your mind for a moment, you can feel why some people call this idea less like comfort and more like a trap, because it suggests a scenario where love becomes asymmetrical. Those you care about are allowed to lose you, but you are not allowed to fully lose them, only to drift away from them, branch by branch, until the version of them you're with is thinner, stranger, and harder to recognize. That's the isolation theorem vibe people talk about. Not a proven theorem in a textbook sense, but a philosophical gravity that seems to fall out of the logic. If your survival is defined by the mere persistence of observation, then the normal social world, the shared world where we meet each other, recognize each other, grow old alongside each other, might not be the world you get to keep. And at this point, a careful listener might ask the most important question. If this is true, why don't we notice it? Why doesn't reality feel like a narrowing hallway? Why does life feel so ordinary, so consistent, so shared? That question leads directly into something subtle inside many worlds itself. The idea of weight or measure. The notion that not all branches are equal in how much reality they carry, even if they all exist in some mathematical sense. In other words, you might be able to keep going and still become a kind of ghost in probability. And that's where our next thought has to go, toward what it would mean to exist in a branch that's technically there, but increasingly marginal. Imagine the many worlds picture as a vast library that never stops expanding. Not a spooky library, just endless shelves, quiet corridors, and an impossible number of books being written at once. Each book is a complete, internally consistent story of reality, one where a particular version of you keeps moving forward moment by moment. And if the wave function never collapses, then nature doesn't pick a single book and burn the rest. It keeps them all. Every edition, every printing, every tiny revision. That sounds at first like abundance, but the idea we need to introduce here is something colder and strangely mathematical. Physicists often talk about measure. Sometimes you'll hear it described as a kind of weight. Not weight like a bowling ball, more like how much of the universe's total story space is occupied by a certain kind of outcome. Because in many worlds, there isn't just one you continuing. There are countless continuations, and there are also countless versions that don't continue. So if you want to speak about what's typical or what's likely, you need a way to count, or at least to weight, the branches. Here's a gentle way to feel it. Picture a simple split. 2 doors, 2 outcomes. Door A leads to a life that continues normally. Door B leads to a life that does not. In the many worlds imagination, both doors happen. The universe doesn't hesitate. It doesn't flip a coin. It simply becomes a superposition of both stories, and then the stories separate into branches that no longer interfere. Now comes the unsettling line that people sometimes whisper when they start thinking about quantum immortality. You only ever find yourself on the side where you're still there. As a piece of subjective phrasing, it has a certain eerie force. But many worlds, as a physical framework, has an immediate counter-pressure. Even if there is some branch where you continue, that doesn't mean that branch is large in measure. It might be a thin thread. And as branching repeats, thin threads can become thinner. To see why, you don't need equations. Just imagine repeating the 2-door setup, not as a dramatic event, but as a conceptual coin flip of reality. Once you have 2 branches. Twice you have 4. 3 times you have 8. And in each round, the set of branches where continuation happens can be a smaller and smaller fraction of the total weight, depending on how you assign those weights. This is where probability weight enters like a quiet, serious character who doesn't raise their voice. Because in many worlds, the usual probabilities of quantum mechanics still show up, not as what will happen, but as how much measure is in each outcome. So when someone says, in many worlds you never experience not continuing, what a careful listener should hear is, there may always exist a continuation branch, but it can become increasingly rare in the space of all branches. And if you take that seriously, the story changes. It stops being about triumph. It starts becoming about marginality. Here's a metaphor the mind can hold without strain. Think of a candle in a dark room. At the start, the flame is steady, warm, obvious. Now imagine that every so often, a gust of wind passes through the room. Not a storm, just a small disturbance. The candle keeps burning, but it's not guaranteed. Sometimes it wavers. Sometimes it almost goes out. If, by coincidence, it stays lit through one gust, that's not so strange. If it stays lit through 1,000 gusts, you begin to sense what the math is suggesting. You might still have a flame, but it's not the typical situation. It's the surviving edge case. And that's what measure feels like in this context. Not a switch, a thinning, a drift toward the outskirts of what's statistically normal. So in this ghost-like reality idea, you don't become a ghost in the supernatural sense. You become a ghost in the probability landscape. You're still in the library. Your book is still being written. But fewer and fewer pages in the grand ledger of the multiverse look like your page. And that has a peculiar psychological consequence. The world around you might start to feel staged. Not because someone is staging it, but because if you insist on always finding yourself in the continuation branch, then, in the most extreme versions of this thought, the conditions required for continuation might become more and more unusual. And what does unusual look like from the inside? It can look like coincidences stacking. It can look like narrow escapes that don't feel earned. It can look like reality bending just enough to keep a thread from snapping. Again, we're not describing anything graphic here. We're staying in the realm of abstract structure, a philosophical mirror held up to a physical interpretation. But the emotional texture is still real, because a life that continues only by riding thinner and thinner measure is not, in this framing, a comfortable victory. It's a kind of statistical exile. And here's the loneliest twist hiding inside that exile. If your continuation branch is increasingly small in measure, then it's increasingly disconnected, not in space, but in normalcy, from the branches where everyone else you love experiences the ordinary arc of life. In other words, even if you continue somewhere, the world that continues with you might become less and less like the shared world you recognize. This is why some people call it ghost-like. Not because you pass through walls, but because you become harder to locate in the thick center of reality's distribution. You're a faint point in a vast cloud, a whisper of measure, a footnote in an infinite archive. And if you're listening to this late at night, you might feel your mind tug in two directions at once. One direction wants to treat it like hope. Somewhere I continue. The other direction notices the cost hidden in that phrasing. If continuation becomes a rarer and rarer kind of branch, what does it mean to live in the rarest kind of world? Hold that gently. Not as a belief, not as a promise, just as a way to understand why this idea can feel so uncanny. It borrows the calm language of physics, measure, weight, distribution, and then it places your most intimate question inside that framework. And once you do that, the multiverse stops being a fireworks show. It becomes a quiet, endless statistics problem, with a human heartbeat at the center. In a moment, we'll take that heartbeat and place it next to an even sharper shadow, the way this thinning measure can separate you from everyone else's story, even if no one is trying to separate anything at all. Sometimes the strange part of this idea isn't the branching itself. It's what happens to your expectations inside a branch that keeps you conscious. Because once you accept the many worlds picture, at least as a thought experiment, you're no longer asking what happens in the normal way. You're asking something slightly different, and it has a shadowy, unsettling logic to it. Given that you are here to notice this moment, what kind of moment must it be? That question sounds harmless, almost philosophical, but it has teeth. In everyday life, we treat likely and unlikely as if they're written into the world like weather. We plan around them, we lean on them, we assume tomorrow will resemble today, not because we're naive, but because the universe has been consistent enough to earn our trust. Yet in the corner of reality we're exploring tonight, the anthropic move quietly changes what you should expect. Anthropic reasoning is a simple idea with a complicated aftertaste. You only ever find yourself in places where finding yourself is possible. If a situation can't contain an observer, can't contain awareness, then no one is there to report it. That doesn't make the impossible possible. It just means selection happens automatically, without permission, without a drum roll. And in a branching universe, selection doesn't just happen once. It happens again and again. Every time there's a fork in outcomes, a small fraction of branches continue cleanly and comfortably, and a much larger spread of branches do not. Many of those end quickly, some drift, some degrade. A few continue in bizarre ways, the way a story continues when the author refuses to end it, but also refuses to make it kind. So the thought goes like this. If you only ever experience branches where you remain able to experience, then from your point of view, the sequence of experienced moments could become biased toward continuation, no matter how thin that continuation becomes. That's the setup. Now comes the texture of the horror. At first, the bias doesn't look like anything at all. It looks like ordinary life. The universe still feels boring in the best way. Coffee tastes like coffee. Streets look like streets. People you love are still there, and your mind continues to treat the future as a gentle extension of the past. But then, if you stay inside this logic for long enough, a strange implication sneaks in. As time passes, the remaining you branches, where observation continues, may represent an increasingly unusual slice of what could have happened. Not magic unusual, not superhero unusual. More like statistically awkward, like a coin that keeps landing heads. Not because coins are cursed, but because you are only paying attention to the runs where the flipping continues. In those runs, survival becomes less like a single event, and more like a filter that keeps being applied. Each time life could have ended, through any number of mundane causes, there exist branches where it didn't. Many of those branches are ordinary. But if the filter is applied enough times, the branches where everything stays ordinary may become rare. And so, the mind begins to picture something that feels like a haunting, but made of probability instead of fog. At some point, the continuing branches might have to include a growing number of unlikely turns, small, almost invisible reversals of what seemed inevitable. Not the kind you'd celebrate, not the kind you'd even notice at first. Just a gentle accumulation of near misses, narrow margins, coincidences that don't look like miracles until they pile up. A meeting that almost didn't happen, but did. A phone call that arrived at exactly the right moment. A minor decision that, in hindsight, seemed to steer you away from something you never knew was waiting. Again, this is important. Nothing supernatural is required here. In a large enough space of outcomes, rare things occur. In many worlds, the suggestion is simply that they occur somewhere, and that somewhere includes branches that still have a watcher. The phrase anthropic shadow is a way to point at the shape of that bias without claiming more than we should. A shadow isn't a thing. It's not an object you can hold. It's a contour, a silhouette cast by constraints. The constraint is, there must be someone to experience the scene. And the silhouette it casts is, experienced scenes may look increasingly selected. If you've ever watched a highlight reel, you know the feeling. A highlight reel can make a player look like they never miss. Not because they never miss, but because misses are edited out. You get a world where the improbable is ordinary, not because the universe changed, but because you only see the subset where the story continues. Anthropic selection is like that, except no editor is making choices. The editing happens automatically because awareness cannot be present in branches where awareness is absent. This is where the tone shifts from curious to quietly uncanny. Because if enough unlikely saves have accumulated, if enough weirdly fortunate turns have stacked up, then a new question arrives, almost tenderly. Would you even be able to tell the difference between ordinary luck and a selection effect that has been shaping your story from the inside? Maybe not. From your seat, you don't see the full tree of branches. You only live one line through it. Your memory is not a census of the multiverse. It's a single thread, and threads can be misleading about the fabric. And that's why the idea feels like a trap. Not because it claims you become immortal in some triumphant way, but because it suggests that, from the inside, continuation could masquerade as meaning. A streak of improbable outcomes might start to feel like a message, or a sign, or a personal favor written into the laws of physics. But in this view, it wouldn't be a favor at all. It would be a statistical artifact, an observer's path drifting toward the regions of the outcome space where observation remains possible. That's the shadow part. You don't see the selection, you see its consequences. You don't feel the filter, you feel the world becoming slightly staged. Not in an obvious way, not like stage lights and painted backdrops. more like the gentle suspicion that reality is becoming oddly cooperative in small ways that are hard to prove and hard to ignore. And if that suspicion grows, it can curdle into something even stranger, a crisis of trust. Because if the world is helping you continue purely through selection, then the continuity of your experience stops being a guarantee of normality. It becomes a clue that you are drifting into the tail of the distribution. A place where events must keep aligning just enough. A place where the line between possible and plausible begins to blur. Now, you don't have to accept any of this as true. Most physicists and philosophers would emphasize that this is speculative, interpretation dependent, and tangled up with deep questions about probability in many worlds. But as a story inside an idea, it's powerful because it takes the most comforting word in the whole concept, survival, and asks you to look closely at what it actually buys. And here, in the dim light of the anthropic shadow, survival doesn't buy you safety. It buys you continuity, a sequence of moments where awareness remains lit, even as the world around that awareness may need to become increasingly unusual to keep the candle from going out. Which brings us to the next unsettling step. If miracles keep piling up, not as magic, but as selection, then you can start to imagine the bubble forming, a pocket of outcomes shaped by the mere fact that you're still here to witness them. At a certain point, the idea stops feeling like you got lucky. It starts feeling like you're living inside a bias. Not a bias in your mood or your memory. Those are ordinary human things. This is a colder kind of bias, the kind that can exist even if you're perfectly calm and perfectly rational. A bias built into the fact that you're here at all, still noticing, still collecting moments one after another. Imagine a vast library where every possible version of your life is shelved somewhere. Most of those books are short. Some end unexpectedly, some fade out, some simply stop mid-sentence. And then there are a few volumes that keep going, page after page, because the conditions needed to keep the story readable keep being met. Anthropic selection is the rule that says, you only ever find yourself reading the books that remain readable. Now bring many worlds into the picture, and the library becomes endless. The shelves don't just contain different choices you made, they contain different outcomes you never chose. Weather shifts, timing shifts, tiny physical variations. An ocean of forks. And if you accept the thought experiment that you only ever experience branches where experience continues, then your personal history, what it feels like to be you, gets quietly filtered through a very specific doorway. Only the branches where observation persists. This is where the probability bubble begins. A bubble is a good metaphor because it's not a wall. It's not an impenetrable barrier. It's just a region with a different pressure inside. A pocket where the rules feel subtly distorted. Not because physics changes, but because your sampling of reality becomes unusual. In ordinary life, you sample reality the way everyone does. You get a mix of outcomes. Some good, some bad, most bland. You don't feel selected. You feel normal. But in the quantum immortality story, as time goes on, you're no longer sampling reality at random. You're sampling it conditional on one thing. You are still here to notice. That conditioning is powerful. It's like asking, what kind of worlds allow a conscious thread to keep running? Not forever as a bold promise, but longer than seems typical. And when you condition on that, when you keep selecting for continued observation, you create a feedback loop that can sound almost like a curse said gently. Survive today and you've narrowed tomorrow. Not morally, not spiritually, statistically. Because every time the world could have branched into you continue and you don't, the set of branches that contain a continuing observer becomes on average more specialized, more constrained, more picky about the exact configuration of events that keep awareness lit. At first, this still looks like everyday life. The bubble is transparent. You might even laugh at the idea because nothing feels strange. The world is still reliable enough, still boring enough, still full of errands and weather and small disappointments. But then, with enough time, enough forks, continuation begins to demand a particular kind of luck. Not loud luck, not lottery luck. The quiet kind that hides in timing and coincidences and near misses you only recognize in hindsight. And that's when the bubble starts to show itself, not as a spectacle, but as a creeping pattern. The world becomes increasingly shaped by whatever conditions keep you able to observe it. If you've ever heard the phrase survivorship bias, this is like the cosmic version of it. Survivorship bias is what happens when you look at only the planes that return from battle and forget the ones that didn't. The sample is skewed by the fact that only the survivors remain to be counted. In this thought experiment, your lived experience could become skewed in the same way. The only worlds you personally witness are the ones where your witnessing continues, which means your subjective timeline becomes a collection of survivor worlds. And here is the unsettling twist. A survivor world does not have to be a pleasant world. It only has to be a world where the minimum conditions for awareness still hold. A thin thread is enough. A flicker can count. So, the bubble doesn't necessarily fill with comfort. It fills with compatibility. Your reality in this framing becomes less about what is likely in the overall multiverse, and more about what is compatible with the fact that you're still watching. That compatibility can start to feel like the world is bending around you, not to reward you, not to protect you, but to keep the camera rolling. And once you notice that possibility, even gently, it can poison a certain kind of peace, because a bubble implies separation. If you are living inside a region of outcomes conditioned on your continued observation, then you are no longer living in the same statistical neighborhood as everyone else. Not because you're special, not because you earned it, but because the selection effect is personal. Your experience is conditioned on your experience. The lonelier this gets, the quieter it becomes. Your loved ones, your friends, strangers at a stoplight, everyone is moving through their own branching trees. In most of those trees, the ordinary rules of probability play out without apology, and many branches don't keep you as a continuing character. From their perspective, the story ends. They grieve, they adapt, they go on. But inside your bubble, the thread continues, and the conditions required to keep it going may gradually pull your line of experience away from the most typical human arc. That's the selection bias cascade. The more you condition on continued observation, the more you restrict the kinds of worlds you can inhabit until your normal becomes a narrow, peculiar normal, one that might feel increasingly artificial, not like a simulation with glitches, more like a life where events keep landing in the one arrangement that allows the next page to turn. You can see why this starts to feel like quantum gaslighting, the way you described it in the outline, because any counter-evidence, anything that would normally reassure you, can be reinterpreted as part of the filtering. Of course it seems normal, the idea whispers. The branches where it didn't remain normal are the ones you no longer occupy. And if you follow that whisper too far, it becomes unfalsifiable from the inside. You cannot step outside your own stream of awareness to compare notes with the branches that didn't continue. You can't do a head count of the lives you didn't experience. All you have is the feeling of continuity. And that's exactly what makes the probability bubble so eerie. It doesn't need fireworks to be frightening. It takes the calmest fact of all, I am still here, and turns it into a question mark. So, by the time you reach this point in the thought experiment, the horror isn't a single dramatic moment. It's the possibility that continuation itself reshapes what you call realistic, until your days are no longer a random walk through outcomes, but a path that keeps curving toward whatever lets the observer keep observing. And once that curve exists, the next question arrives naturally, almost softly. If the bubble keeps tightening, if the required coincidences keep stacking, what happens to the feeling that the world is authentic and not merely viable? If the probability bubble idea feels unsettling on its own, the next step makes it feel crowded. Because once you accept the logic of selection, I only ever find myself where I can still observe, it stops being purely personal. It becomes a question about what happens when many observers across many branches all carry that same quiet condition. Not in a mystical way, in a bookkeeping way. Picture reality as a huge landscape of possibilities, most of them ordinary, some of them wild, all of them allowed by whatever the true rules are. In everyday thinking, you and I move through that landscape like hikers. We don't control the terrain, we just walk it. But the probability bubble framing suggests something subtly different. You're not sampling the whole landscape anymore. You're sampling a narrower trail, one that keeps selecting for continued observation. Now, imagine you're not the only hiker with that constraint. If quantum immortality were even partly right, if there are countless continuing threads scattered across the branching structure, then the landscape might not just be filtered by one observer's survival condition. It could be filtered by many overlapping survival conditions, layered on top of each other like transparent sheets. And that's where reality saturation enters the story. Saturation is what happens when a system becomes crowded with constraints, like a sponge holding more and more water until it can't hold any more without changing shape. The sponge is still a sponge, but the details, the softness, the boundaries, start to behave differently because there's no slack left. In this thought experiment, the water is the set of improbable requirements needed to keep observation going. One continuing observer might nudge their personal path into a slightly unusual set of outcomes. But if there are many continuing observers, many threads that, by definition, keep finding themselves in branches where they can still notice, then those nudges don't stay isolated, they pile up. Not because observers are causing the universe to bend like a wish-granting machine, but because we are describing a sampling effect that can become self-reinforcing. The only branches we hear from are the ones compatible with continued observation. If there are lots of continuing observers, then in some regions of the multiverse, you'd expect a heavy concentration of observer-compatible conditions. And when you concentrate conditions like that, you start walking into a philosophical minefield that people usually reserve for cosmology. The fine-tuning question. You've probably heard this in its classic form. Why do the constants of physics seem to sit in a narrow range that allows complex chemistry, stars, and life? Why is the universe not trivially sterile? There are sober, mainstream ways to talk about that. Some people emphasize unknown, deeper principles. Some emphasize selection effects. We shouldn't be surprised to find ourselves in a universe compatible with our existence, because incompatible universes would contain no one to ask the question. That's the anthropic move, and in moderation, it's reasonable. But inside the quantum immortality framing, something more intimate happens. Fine-tuning stops being a distant question about the early universe. It becomes a question about your next day. Because the tuning is no longer just about whether life can exist somewhere. It's about whether your stream of awareness can continue to exist, continuously, through an ever-growing forest of branching outcomes. And if that continuation is rare, if it requires progressively stranger alignments, then your lived experience might start to feel like it's happening inside a universe that is tuned, not just for life, but for continued observation. This is where the authenticity crisis begins. Because you can ask, very softly, a question that sounds simple and ends up corrosive. Am I seeing the world as it is, or the world as it must be for me to still be here seeing it? That's a different kind of doubt than everyday anxiety. It's not, what if I'm wrong about my decisions? It's, what if the very texture of my reality is being selected for viability rather than truth? In this framing, reality can become minimum viable, in the same way a company can become minimum viable when it's barely meeting requirements. The product works, it boots up, it runs, but it's stripped down to what's necessary. A minimum viable reality would be a world that still behaves coherently enough for an observer to remain an observer, still enough regularity to form memories, still enough stability to make expectations, still enough continuity to say, this is my life. But it might not be the most typical world. It might not be the most probable. It might not even be the most generous. It would simply be the world that keeps the lights on. And if you let that idea bloom gently, it produces a peculiar dread, not the dread of danger, but the dread of hollowness. Because authenticity is the feeling that your world is not staged for you, that it has its own independent weight, that it would keep being itself even if you weren't watching. It's the comfort of believing you're a passenger, not the reason the train tracks exist. The probability bubble logic threatens that comfort. It suggests you might be drifting toward a region where your continued observation and the structure of events are no longer loosely connected. They're tightly coupled, where the room reality has to be random and messy gets smaller and smaller. And then there's one more twist, quiet but sharp. If many continuing observers exist, then their constraints might not align perfectly. One observer's viable branch might require circumstances that make another observer's continued observation less likely. These overlapping selection pressures could create a kind of competition for consistency, as if reality has to satisfy multiple ongoing, still observing conditions at once. You can start to imagine a saturated zone where the universe feels oddly arranged, not in the cartoon sense of impossible coincidences every 5 minutes, but in the subtle sense that events keep landing in the narrow band that preserves observation across many threads. At that point, the fine-tuning question becomes almost personal. Are we studying the real universe or an observer-shaped one? And if it's observer-shaped, if it is increasingly carved into a form that keeps awareness barely continuous, then you can see how the nightmare changes shape. It's no longer just about survival. It's about the price of survival being a gradual slide into a world that feels technically functional, but spiritually thin. A world that meets the requirements without guaranteeing the richness we usually mean when we say life, which sets up the next thought almost inevitably. If keeping observation going requires more and more careful arrangements, more and more engineering of conditions, then what does that cost? Not emotionally, cosmically. Sometimes the strangest part of a terrifying idea isn't what it promises you. It's what it would demand from everything else. If you take the quantum immortality story at face value, just for a moment, then the universe becomes more than a place you live inside. It becomes a kind of caretaker, a quiet machine that keeps the lights on in one specific room, the room where you are still aware. And that's where the dread deepens, because awareness isn't free. In ordinary life, consciousness feels like a private lantern, a warm bubble behind your eyes. But physically, it's a process. Patterns held together inside matter, maintained by energy, protected from noise, kept from dissolving into randomness. Even a single thought is a small act of resistance against the natural drift toward disorder. Physics has a name for that drift: entropy. Entropy is the universe's slow habit of letting sharp things blur. Heat spreads, gradients flatten, structures break down. The cosmos isn't evil about it. It's simply patient. It moves in one direction, and it never needs to hurry. So, if a person's awareness were somehow guaranteed to persist, always finding itself in the rare branch where it continues, then the question becomes uncomfortable in a new way. Continue. How? Because as time stretches forward, the universe offers fewer easy ways to keep complex patterns intact. Stars run out. New fuel becomes harder to find. Free energy, useful energy, gets diluted. The cosmos becomes calmer, colder, more uniform. Less like a living room, more like a quiet hallway with the lights dimming one by one. This is where the cosmic ICU metaphor whispers its way into the story. Imagine a hospital at night, not the dramatic kind you see on TV, just the real thing. Fluorescent lights, soft footsteps, a few machines humming in the background. Most rooms are dark, but one room has a steady, focused attention because inside it, something fragile is being kept going, not healed into forever, just maintained. If the universe had to keep you going in the far future, it wouldn't be doing it with kindness. It would be doing it with constraints, with improbabilities, with increasingly engineered conditions as the natural conditions for stable, rich experience fade away. And the cost shows up in a peculiar place. Not in dollars, not in drama, in probability. In many worlds' language, what's common is cheap. What's rare is expensive, not in money, but in measure. It takes more branching work to reach it. It occupies less of the total weight of reality. So, the continuing version of you would, in a sense, become a more and more specialized outcome. A narrow corridor through the space of possibilities, and that narrowness feels like a cosmic price tag. Because the more specialized the corridor becomes, the more the universe starts to resemble a support system built around a single requirement. Observation must continue. That requirement has an eerie side effect. It suggests that your surroundings might gradually stop being the broad, generous world you remember, full of redundancy and randomness and unplanned beauty, and instead become the minimum arrangement that still allows an observer to exist at all. A minimum viable reality, not a simulation necessarily, not a conspiracy, just a selection effect pushed to an extreme. As the easy branches disappear, you keep waking up in branches that meet stricter and stricter conditions, branches that feel less like open life and more like scaffolding. And if you lean into the analogy, it starts to feel like this. The universe isn't a stage anymore. It's equipment. A long, quiet process of keeping one candle lit in a windless, cooling room. Now, add the heat death mood, not as a horror movie ending, but as a gentle cosmic forecast. Over unimaginably long time scales, the universe trends toward equilibrium. Nothing happens in the dramatic sense. But in that stillness, sustaining complexity becomes harder to do accidentally. So, the continuing observer, if such a thing were even meaningful, would be pulled into stranger and stranger pockets where complexity survives, where gradients still exist, where some tiny engine still turns. And in a story like this, that can start to feel like a universe bending around you, not because it cares, because selection would only let you notice worlds where noticing remains possible. That's the unsettling pivot, not I live forever, but what does forever look like when the cosmos is trying to go quiet? It looks like a narrowing. It looks like maintenance. It looks like the universe slowly converting from a wild place where anything might happen into a carefully constrained place where only one thing must happen: awareness. And if you're listening late at night, it's okay if that lands like a cold pebble in your palm. Because in the very next breath, we have to admit something important. This entire line of thought is a story built on stacked assumptions, a poetic extrapolation from an interpretation of quantum mechanics, not a conclusion we can cash out as a prediction. Still, it leaves a haunting aftertaste. If the universe ever does feel like it's dimming, the most human response might not be to demand immortality. It might be to notice gently how astonishing it is that anything is lit at all. There's a moment in this idea, quiet, almost polite, where the physics steps back and something more human steps forward. Because if you let quantum immortality linger in your mind for long enough, it stops sounding like a hypothesis and starts acting like a temptation. Not a loud one, not a dramatic one, a subtle one. It whispers, if there's always a branch where you continue, then from the inside, you never meet the ending. And if you never meet the ending, if you can't ever experience your own absence, then maybe you're insulated from the final consequence. That whisper has a name in ethics: moral hazard. It's what happens when a belief, true or not, makes risk feel cheaper than it really is. In everyday life, moral hazard shows up when someone feels protected by a guarantee, a bailout, a safety net, an insurance policy. The protection may be real, but it changes behavior in a way that creates new danger. Quantum immortality, taken literally, can imitate that same psychological shape. It can bend the way a person relates to ordinary caution. It can make danger feel like something that only happens to other versions of you. And that's where the trap begins, because the idea is not a license. Even inside many worlds, branches where you don't continue are still real. Real experiences for real observers, real grief for real families, real consequences in countless timelines. Nothing about this thought experiment removes harm from the world. It only plays a strange trick with perspective. So if the idea ever feels thrilling or oddly comforting, it's worth holding it at arm's length and saying, that feeling is a cognitive side effect, not evidence. And then comes the second layer of the trap, unfalsifiability. A scientific claim earns trust by risking embarrassment, by placing itself in a position where reality can prove it wrong. But quantum immortality is slippery in a very specific way. It tries to make your own point of view the only courtroom that matters. If you ask, how would I know this is false? The answer tends to be, you wouldn't. Because you'd only ever find yourself in the branch where you're still here to ask. That sounds clever. It also removes the safety rails of reality checking. Because now the idea isn't just hard to test, it becomes personally untestable. No matter what happens, your continued awareness can be framed as consistent with the theory. And any observation that would contradict it, an observation from the branch where you don't continue, is by definition not available to you. It's like trying to disprove the claim you will never see darkness, while insisting that every time you close your eyes, that moment doesn't count as evidence. This is why philosophers get uneasy. Not because the mathematics is obviously wrong, but because the claim starts behaving like a belief system, self-sealing, self-protecting, immune to the usual pressure of counterexample. And that leads to the third layer, the one that feels most like a cold room with soft lighting, the disproof paradox. In its strangest form, it goes like this. If you hear a strong argument against quantum immortality, you might say, good, that reduces the fear. But the trap can twist even that into fuel. It can say, of course you would encounter persuasive objections. A mind that stays alive in improbable branches might also be the kind of mind that gets surrounded by comforting narratives, because those narratives stabilize it. The objections are just part of the bubble. They're allowed. And now, anything can be reinterpreted as confirmation. If you feel dread, the theory says, that dread is you sensing the edge. If you feel calm, it says, that calm is the universe keeping you steady. If experts disagree, it says, that disagreement is exactly what you would expect. If you try to refute it, it says, your refutation is already inside the maze. This is the quantum gaslighting effect. Not a person manipulating you, but a concept that, once it grabs the steering wheel, can reinterpret every road sign as pointing deeper into itself. And that's the true human hazard here. Not the physics, but the psychology. A thought experiment is supposed to be a flashlight. You point it at an idea and see what it reveals. But sometimes the flashlight becomes a mirror and you start seeing your own hopes and fears reflected back, dressed up in equations. So it helps to say very gently, even if the story is internally consistent, that doesn't mean it's healthy to live inside it. In fact, the more a belief becomes impossible to disprove from the inside, the more careful we should be about giving it too much power over our emotional life. And that sets up the next move, the calm pushback, where we step away from the hypnotic logic and ask what neuroscience, philosophy of identity, and the messy problem of probability in many worlds might say in reply. Even in a story as eerie as Quantum Immortality, there's a quieter voice that steps in, one that doesn't shout and doesn't panic. It simply asks for the bill. What would the universe have to do, physically, for this idea to be true? Start with the most grounded pushback. Whatever consciousness is, it behaves like a process. Something the brain does, not something that floats free. When the machinery is changed, the experience changes. When the machinery stops, the experience stops appearing in the usual ways. That's not poetry. It's the steady pattern we see across sleep, anesthesia, injury, disease, development, and recovery. Philosophers like Patricia and Paul Churchland have long leaned into that hard-edged view. Mind is what matter does when organized a certain way. Antonio Damasio's work too circles a similar point. Our sense of self is not a ghost steering the body. It's a living construction built from regulation, memory, emotion, and prediction. If consciousness depends on a particular substrate and its ongoing dynamics, then I will always find myself somewhere starts to sound less like physics and more like a story we tell from inside the stream. Then comes the identity question, the one that feels simple until it isn't. In many worlds, there may be countless versions of you, but are they you in the way you mean it at midnight when you're thinking about endings? Derek Parfit's style of argument gently breaks the spell. If perfect copies split off, continuity becomes a family resemblance, not a single, unbroken thread. You might care about those future versions, like you care about a child you raised or a friend you deeply know, but that's not the same as guaranteeing a personal I that can never stop. When people say, you only ever experience the surviving branch, they quietly smuggle in a strong assumption that the you doing the experiencing is a unique traveler hopping from branch to branch. Many worlds, as usually presented, doesn't include a branch-hopping pilot. And even if we stay strictly inside physics, there's the slippery math problem called measure. In a branching universe, how much of you ends up in each outcome matters, not just morally, mathematically. Without a clear account of probability, why some branches should count more than others, the phrase, "you will find yourself," becomes fuzzy. It turns into a grammar trick, taking a third-person description of many outcomes and translating it into a first-person guarantee. Philosophers and physicists like Hilary Greaves have pointed out that getting probability to behave inside many worlds is not a throwaway detail. It's one of the central difficulties. If the rule that assigns weights to branches is unclear, then the claim of inevitable subjective survival is standing on ice that hasn't fully frozen. There's also a broader humility check. Many worlds is an interpretation. It's a way of reading the same equations, and the equations, so far, don't force one metaphysical picture. Sean Carroll often emphasizes this distinction. The math is precise. The story we tell about what the math means is where philosophy quietly enters. That doesn't make many worlds wrong. It just means it isn't a settled fact that can carry infinite personal conclusions on its back. Finally, there's the hidden superpower problem. If quantum immortality feels true because you always end up in the continuing branch, then something about your viewpoint seems to be doing selection, favoring one set of outcomes over another. But ordinary physics doesn't give consciousness a special dial that chooses realities. In fact, Many Worlds was partly loved because it removes any special role for minds in the machinery. So if the argument reintroduces a mind-like selection effect, an I that can only wake up in certain places, it risks contradicting the very reason the interpretation was attractive in the first place. So, the calm rebuttal is not a slam of the door. It's a soft closing of the ledger. The idea is haunting, and it's strangely beautiful, but it may be leaning on assumptions that physics doesn't actually grant. So, even if it's poetic, it may not be physically real. And after all of that, after the branching diagrams, the strange logic, the chill of what if, it can help to set the whole idea down gently, the way you'd set down a heavy book on a quiet nightstand. Because maybe the most honest takeaway isn't that consciousness is guaranteed to go on forever. Maybe it's simply this: we still don't know what it truly is, or why it feels like a single, continuous lantern moving through the dark. Physics can describe patterns with breathtaking accuracy. It can tell us how atoms trade energy, how light behaves, how probability spreads like a mist over everything that could happen. And yet, your awareness, this simple fact that there is something it is like to be you, still arrives each moment like a small miracle that refuses to be reduced to a diagram. So if quantum immortality ever feels seductive, maybe it's because it echoes a deeper human longing, not to win against the universe, but to understand why being here at all feels so vivid. Maybe the real mystery isn't whether reality splits. Maybe it's why you can notice the splitting in the first place. If you found something meaningful in tonight's quiet exploration, you can support the channel in a gentle way by liking the video, subscribing, or sharing it with someone who enjoys calm science at bedtime. And if you'd like, leave a comment with where you're listening from and what time it is in your corner of the world. I love seeing how far these late-night thoughts travel. For now, you don't need to solve anything. You don't need to hold the paradox in your hands. Just let the question rest, and let your mind do what minds have always done best. Soften at the edges, drift towards stillness, and float into sleep, in the quiet mystery of being aware at all. Good night.